Well, welcome tonight to the Cambridge Forum. As Pat said, we're discussing bullies and cyberbullies with neuroscientist Tracy Vaillancourt, psychologist Elizabeth Englander, and storyteller Odds Bodkin. I'm Sasha Helper, and as Pat had said, I am a physician who takes care of children with emotional illness, and I try to use culture and art in part in the way I help them. I'll be your moderator for tonight. Schoolyard bullies have been with us since Hercules in ancient Greece, but a new 21st century form of bullying has appeared, cyberbullying. Although it doesn't use physical force, it has proved to be just as damaging. Following recent suicides of student victims of bullies and cyberbullies, attitudes towards bullying have changed. Parents, authority figures, teachers, police, the government, no one can any longer say boys will just be boys and girls will just be boys, or girls. Sorry, boys will be boys or girls will be girls. Massachusetts school districts are now required to develop a plan to address bullying. Our panelists examine the phenomena of bullying today through the lens of psychology, through neuroscience, and through culture to broaden our understanding of this dangerous, aggressive behavior. How is bullying different today than in the past years and centuries? What can we learn from the accumulated wisdom of culture and from modern discoveries of neuroscience about the impact of bullying both on the victim and on the victimizer? How can we change this destructive behavior? First, let me introduce you to our panelists tonight, and then we'll move right into our discussion, beginning with Dr. Englander. Dr. Elizabeth Englander is a professor of psychology and director of MARC, the Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center at Bridgewater State University. Her major area of interest is in the childhood causes of abusive and violent behavior, and her research looks at bullying, cyberbullying behavior during school years. MARC works with BSU students in bringing bullying and cyberbullying research and programs to the K-12 schools in the Commonwealth. Dr. Englander has helped author and pass state legislation. She's trained thousands of teachers and tens of thousands of students in the Commonwealth. Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt is a Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Education and the School of Psychology. She's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior at McMaster University and a core member of the Offord Center for Child Studies. Dr. Vaillancourt's research examines the links between aggression and biopsychosocial functioning and mental health, with a particular focus on bully-victim relationships. Dr. Vaillancourt is currently leading a community university research alliance on the prevention and intervention of bullying, which is funded by the Social Sciences and the Humanities Research Council of Canada and also by Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Odds Bodkin's character voice and music-filled storytelling style has mesmerized listeners for 24 years. Mr. Bodkin taught at Antioch, New England Graduate School. He's been a featured storyteller at the National Storytelling Festival. He's performed at the White House twice and at many other prominent locations. Accompanying himself on the 12-string guitar, the Celtic harp, a grand piano, and other instruments, he has produced 17 award-winning audio recordings. He has recently developed an anti-bullying curriculum entitled The Rage of Hercules. So welcome to the Cambridge Forum, and let's start with Elizabeth Englander.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Helper. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. I hope that it will be interesting and informative for you. My name is Elizabeth Englander, and I'm a professor of psychology and the director of the Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center at Bridgewater State University. And my primary area of interest has been in development in children and the problems in development that lead children to be abusive and aggressive. My second area of interest, which really until about 2005 had absolutely nothing to do with my first area, has been how humans use technology, how we use information technology, and how that affects communication. I was always sort of a techie nerd, and I enjoyed that because it really didn't have anything to do with psychology. It was a very different field. And it was a lot of fun and interesting, and you get lots of toys and stuff like that. About 2005, 2006, everything really began to change in understanding how children were being abusive towards each other. And technology became at the forefront of what we were studying. And we, at that time, really began to focus on it a little bit more. So now the work that I do really seeks fundamentally to integrate some of the issues around the use and the explosion of information technology, how that's impacted children socially, and particularly how it's impacted their abusive or aggressive tendencies. The Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center conducts research. We also do many programs and services in K through 12 education around the Commonwealth. Our programs impact roughly 100,000 children a year, and we spend a lot of time doing that. The center itself is staffed by faculty, by graduate and undergraduate students at the university, and that's a very important part of its mission, which is to train students who are going into these fields in the future. And we take that part of it very seriously. We were also, I was also very closely involved with the development of the law that passed last year. MARC is different from other centers. It's not just different in that we're at a university or at a public university. It's also different because we operate on a different model than most of the centers that work on these issues. Most of the programs that we do in schools, and we do many programs where we train faculty, we work with kids, we work with communities, are in-depth, they're very comprehensive, and they also are free to the communities and schools that get them. And that's a different model. And by establishing the center, I was really attempting to bring mental health services for children into a different kind of expectation in the Commonwealth, and to really bring service to all of the children in the communities that might struggle to afford more sophisticated programs. The research that we do is on college students. We do a lot of research on freshmen, which is retrospective research, meaning that we ask them to look back on their experiences in high school. We also do prospective research on children ages 8 through 18. Right now, we have finished analyzing the first wave of that data, which involves 21,000 children in the Commonwealth. There's more data coming in. And that kind of data has given us a very valuable snapshot of what children are encountering as they grow through school here in Massachusetts, and what kinds of problems they run into, and what kinds of access they have to technology, some of which frankly surprised even us. And we have a pretty good idea of what access kids have because we work with kids every day. Some of the big findings that I thought I might share with you in our research that have been of the most interest have been around what bullying is and sort of what it looks like today. When I was in high school, bullying was largely a physical phenomenon. And there were a couple of bullies at my high school, but you sort of avoided them, and if you did, you were okay. You stuck with your friends, and you just knew who not to run into, and they were largely strong-arming people. Today, though, bullying is an abuse behavior, and it is an abuse behavior that is very psychological in nature, largely not physical. And it is really needs to belong sort of in that family. The kinds of behaviors that we see the most commonly in our research and in school settings, and it's very consistent across the lab and the field, are what we call gateway behaviors. And gateway behaviors are essentially social behaviors that children use to establish dominance and to put down targets. But these behaviors don't break any school rules. And so children can use them often with impunity because they believe that they're not going to get into any trouble for doing them. So examples of gateway behaviors would be doing something like whispering or laughing pointedly at a target. There's no rule against laughing in school or whispering. Rolling your eyes when somebody gets an answer wrong in class just to show them that you think they're an idiot. Things like that really demonstrate the status quo, and those behaviors are by far the most common. The old style sort of physical bullying that we used to talk about on the research has largely dropped off the charts. Schools do not tolerate physical altercations, and that's really reflected in the data that we see. Another difference is that back when I started my research in graduate school, which was about 25 years ago, we didn't even study girls. Girls were not relevant. Girls were just not part of the problem. Today, girls are a central focus of what's going on, and we have seen a massive influx in what they're involved in. It's also notable that we find that very different kinds of children engage in bullying behaviors. Some of them are what we call successful bullies. They're very good socially. They're good with adults. They have good social skills. They tend not to have special needs or other issues like that. And their bullying protects their status. They're not targeted or victimized. Other kids are what we call unsuccessful bullies. And we call them that because they're also targets as well as being bullies. And they're not as socially adept. They're far more likely to be on IEPs or to have special needs. They have much, much lower social skill scores, and they're quite different as a group. Bullying is, by the way, also related to other abuse behaviors. So it's related in our research to having been a target of dating violence, which you could argue really is just bullying. That's semantics. And it's related to in our research, in any case, to bullying between siblings. Other researchers have also linked it to other kinds of family violence. Probably the biggest change, though, is the internet and electronic communications. I cannot overemphasize the impact of the widespread use of electronic communications on this generation of children. I cannot overstate that. I think it is an enormous impact in every area of their lives. And they are struggling to learn how to cope with it, and adults who are also struggling to learn how to cope with it, except we learn a little bit more slowly, are sometimes struggling to keep up. In our research by high school, there is almost no bullying that goes on just in school. It's either all online or it's both in school and online. Almost none of it is just in school by high school. And that trend is very, very marked. I think the thing to remember about the internet and electronic communications and cyberbullying is these issues are not separate for children. They are very much a part of their existence. As adults, we have a tendency to look at them as being separate, to say there's bullying, there's cyberbullying, and these two things are separate. For children, they are not separate. They are part of their lives right from the get-go. In the research that we do on 8-year-olds and 8 to 13-year-olds, we find that by third grade, over 90% of children in Massachusetts are online. They are playing interactive games online with their peers. Yet most systems and schools, not just in Massachusetts, but everywhere in my experience, don't even attempt to educate children about how to use information technology until they're probably in 6th or 7th grade, 5 years after they've started, 6 years after they've started. Almost 20% of children in the Commonwealth own a cell phone by 3rd grade. 20%! And that number doubles by 5th grade. I have to tell you, I'm the mother of 3 children, and I cannot fathom how you can get a third grader to not lose a cell phone. I mean, my children would all have instantly lost their cell phones. And so to me, it's amazing that 1 in 5 even own them. But the fact that it's 40% by 5th grade means that the train has left the station. It's time for us to understand that this is the reality for kids. It greatly impacts their social communications and their social lives. Social abusiveness is only one area. It happens to be the area I study the most. But it's a profound impact in many ways. And I think that one of the things that as adults we struggle with is understanding how electronic communication changes just the way we communicate, because it does change it quite substantially. And that's one of the things that we need to learn, and we need to begin to teach children about this, because, you know, they're either going to learn it or they're not. And that's really those are the only choices. Finally, I think the other thing that is really astonishing to me is that adults tend to look at kids as knowing everything about technology and being wonderfully savvy about computers. And actually, in our research, we find that they're pretty ignorant. They're not afraid of technology. You know, we're afraid of it. So we might pick up a device and we don't want to break it. You know, we don't want to push the wrong button and break it. So we're careful when we're looking around at it. Children they don't have that fear. They'll just pick it up and they'll start pushing all the buttons and yanking all the levers, and they have no fear about that. But they're not knowledgeable, not really. When we actually tested kids on how much they knew and understood about cyberbullying and about how information technology changed their social communication, they scored as a group in the C or D range. They didn't score well. So I think that one of the areas we really need to focus on, in addition to social communications problems, are how communications have changed, because that has a huge impact on their social lives and their social communications and their social skills. So, having said that.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'd like to just welcome you to the Cambridge Forum, and tonight again we're focusing on bullies and cyberbullying, intervention, and understanding these children. And now we'll hear from Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt.
Thank you, and so pleased to be here. My first time. I'm from Ottawa, not originally from Vancouver, but so it's lovely to be here. I asked if I could go second because I knew Elizabeth would be amazing and would calm me. And then I got nervous because you did so well. So now my cortisol is so high, and I'm going to talk about that, and it's going to impair my memory. So I'm going to use my notes and hopefully get through this. So it's like a live experiment right now. In any event. When we think about bullying, we think about it as being a special case of aggression. It's characterized by being repeated in nature, intentional, and the fact that there is a pretty profound power imbalance between the aggressor and his or her victim. In other words, bullying is a systematic abuse of power. We know that bullying causes harm. It's associated with significant physical health issues, stomach aches, migraines, getting more colds and the like, academic difficulties such as school failure and school dropout, and it is causally, yes, I'm using the word causal, it is causally linked to mental health difficulties such as anxiety and depression. Children who are bullied hurt. In fact, they hurt so much that they sometimes take their life. Just last week, we had a boy in the high school that I work with in terms of research who committed suicide as a consequence of being bullied. Being bullied is stressful. Several studies, including a study from our lab, have shown a relationship between being bullied and dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the HPA axis, I'll call it that from now on, and that's estimated via the stress hormone cortisol. When you're stressed out, you produce cortisol. Recently, we showed in a longitudinal study that was just published in the journal Brain and Cognition that being bullied hurts the brain. Specifically, children who were victimized became depressed. And in turn, depression predicted dysregulation of the HPA axis. This in turn predicted memory deficits. Recall that I said that bullying, being bullied, is associated with academic difficulties. Perhaps it has to do with deficits that have occurred as a consequence of the stress of being tormented. So stated more simply, bully kids get stressed out, and the stress hormone they produce, cortisol, adversely affects their memory in the same way that has been shown to affect the memory in animals and non-human primates. So there's a convincing body of literature in that area showing the adverse effects of cortisol on memory and how it actually causes brain damage if it's elevated too high, in particular to glucocorticoid receptor sites, such as the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. A very interesting study was just published. It's by another French-Canadian, so I'll give her a shout out, Isabelle Ouellette-Morin. And it was a really clever study. So they looked at monozygotic twins who were discordant on being bullied. So some were bullied, some weren't. So these individuals share the same gene and presumably a very similar environment. And what they found was that those that were bullied, when they did a stress task in the lab, they had a blunted cortisol reactivity. And they concluded from their experiment, this natural experiment, that there was a causal effect of adverse childhood experience on the neuroendocrine response to stress. So why this level of impairment? Why is it that children don't fare well when they're bullied? Well, we know that the need to belong is a fundamental human motivator. We are wired to belong. In fact, the need to belong is so strong that a recent study showed that being rejected by a deplorable and loathed group like the Ku Klux Klan was perceived as hurtful to people who were not part of nor condone such a group. Have you ever had the experience where you find out that somebody you don't like doesn't like you back and it hurts you? That's sort of what this study showed. Even if you don't like the person, when you find out they're rejecting you in turn, it is hurtful. Social ties are not just a luxury. Rather, they're essential for optimal development. We know this from evidence coming from social deprivation studies or naturally occurring instances in which people were isolated from others. And I'll give you 3 examples. First of all, there's the effects, the negative effects of the low infant to child care provider ratio of orphanages. So the Romanian orphanage studies showed that when babies were neglected, the ratio was 20-1 in some places. They did not fare well. In fact, a lot of them ended up looking like they had autism. In the early 1900s, there was a huge issue with infant mortality. The infant mortality rate in hospitals was enormous. And so one of the prevailing hypotheses at the time was that it was caused by bacteria. It's reasonable to assume that people get infected in hospitals, would it not be? In any event, so one way to guard against this was that they placed babies in these small cubicle rooms. So in a sense, it was like a crib with plexiglass. Of course, it wasn't plexiglass. This was the early 1900s. And they forbade parents from visiting their infant. And they had these babies barely touched because they didn't want to stir up the bacteria. And guess what happened to the infant mortality rate? It was even worse. Exactly. Babies need their mamas. They need to be touched. And we know that from Harry Harlow's monkey studies. Harry Harlow's experiments were brilliant. What he did was he isolated juvenile monkeys from either their mother or their peers or both. And what he showed convincingly through experimental design was that juvenile monkeys thrive when they were raised among family and peers. And what's really interesting about those studies, and a lot of people forget because they concentrated more on the attachment part with mothers, is that when they were isolated from either during infancy, they didn't do well, but especially when they were isolated from peers. Those monkeys grew up to be funny monkeys. They were atypically shy, asocial, some were hyper-aggressive, and interestingly, the longer they were isolated from peers, the worse their adjustment. So what does neuroscience tell us about this? Studies show that you can relive and re-experience social pain, so ostracism, rejection, shunning, more easily than physical pain, and that the emotions you feel are more intense and painful. So, for example, I would bet that everybody in this audience has had an experience with being bullied at some point in their life. And if I had you recall that experience, it's very likely that you will experience a visceral reaction. You will feel the emotions very similarly to when the actual event occurred. If I then asked you to think about a time when you were physically injured, you would not probably conjure up an emotional reaction to it. You would think about it from a cognitive perspective. You would obviously think about the events that occurred. And probably that's linked to evolution. I mean, we wouldn't want to really recall, from a visceral point of view, childbirth, ever. Again, you wouldn't have any more babies. We wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be in Cambridge Forum at this point. So it seems that physical pain is often short-lived, whereas social pain can last a lifetime. And that explains why my 88-year-old neighbor still cries when she tells me about the time when she was bullied when she was 12. Recent neuroimaging studies using fMRI have shown that parts of the cortical physical pain network are also activated when a person is socially excluded. This is really cool stuff. So basically, the parts of your brain that are activated when, let's say, you injure your toe, when you stub it, are the same or very similar regions to what lights up when somebody's being excluded. The physical and social pain share similar neural structures. They're overlapping systems, it seems. And what we think is that this is linked to evolution, that this sort of overlapping has increased our survival because we needed a neural alarm. We needed a neural alarm to say, you need to belong to the group, you need to work hard to stay in that group, you need to get along. If you didn't belong to a group, historically, it would mean you would die. You needed the group to protect you. Mike Crowley just published a study where he used event-related potentials, so he used ERPs to study the neural activity that occurs when a person is being rejected. So he used ERPs with children, and he found that rejection is differentiated in less than 500 milliseconds. The neural alarm is big and it's quick. So taken together, these recent brain studies provide support for why bullying hurts so much. Why some children cry themselves to bed at night because nobody wants to play with them. And a lot of times as adults, we kind of shoo that away. We say, come on, that's just silly. And yet, the evidence from neuroscience provides support that it hurts. It explains why we use things, language such as, it broke my heart when she did that, or it felt like somebody punched me in the stomach when they told me I couldn't do or I couldn't come to their party. We are wired to belong. It's rooted in our evolutionary past, and it has been historically linked to our survival. But why is it that some children seem to fare poorly and some children seem to cope better? In the area of genetics, studies have shown that the influence of stress, such as the stress of being maltreated by a caregiver or the stress of being bullied by a peer, so the influence of stress on depression is moderated by a person's biology. This is called a diathesis stress model. As one example, and I'll just put it out there that there is a little bit of controversy about this study. It was published in Science by Caspi et al. They looked at the risk of becoming depressed at the age of 26 as a consequence of being maltreated as a child. And what they found was that if you had a polymorphism of your serotonin transporter gene, your 5-HTT gene, you were either more likely or less likely to be depressed. So individuals who had two short alleles for the 5-HTT gene were far more likely to be depressed at age 26. In fact, about 70% of them were depressed. Whereas if you had two long alleles, you were protected. So comparing those who had two long alleles who were severely maltreated in childhood to those who were not maltreated, their risk for depression was no greater than the general population in a sense. So they had no elevated risk. In a recent study published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry by Benjent, they found the exact same finding with respect to peer victimization. They looked at the moderating effect of 5-HTT on relational peer victimization, so the type of peer victimization that Elizabeth spoke about that happens so frequently, you know, excluding somebody from the peer group, all the eye rolls, that sort of thing, on depressive symptoms in adolescent girls. And again, they found that those with a short allele were far more likely to be depressed than those with a long allele. So the bulk of my work is about sort of shedding light on the neurological or the biological underpinnings of peer victimization. And the reason I focus on that is because I think it helps legitimize the plight of peer abused kids. I so often hear from principals about how a kid is whiny or a drama queen. And they use an example of somebody who was bullied and seems just fine. But Claire is not fine, and she's not fine because she's making too much about it. I think that what they fail to understand is that the heterogeneity in outcome has much to do with the complexity of humans, that you have an environmental trigger that's interacting with a biological predisposition, which in turn changes biology. So we haven't even talked about epigenetics, but we certainly can. And all of this culminates in some child going left and some child going right. And I think that if we could engage policymakers and practitioners into understanding why it is that not all children become impaired as a consequence, then maybe they might prioritize the reduction of school bullying. Now, just as a side note, in Ontario, I'm going to brag about Canada for a second, because I think Canadians are known for bragging about Canada. So I might as well keep the stereotype alive. We have a law in Ontario. We have two laws. We have Bill 157 and 212. Doesn't mean much, but they're part of our Education Act, our Safe Schools Act. And social bullying is included. So we actually do punish children for being inappropriate with each other, not just physically and verbally, but also socially and also on the internet. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Again, you're here at the Cambridge Forum, and right now we'll hear Mr. Odds Bodkin speak and perform to your delight.
Thank you. Good evening. I come at this from a very different perspective. I admire the science, and I admire the insight into the nature of the dilemma with digital media and the free-for-all that children plummet into. I'm a professional storyteller and children's author. 10 years ago, the Art Institute of Chicago commissioned me to do a piece about the legendary hero Hercules. I said I'd love to. They had an exhibit that they wanted a performance to accompany. I began to look into the actual myth of Hercules and discovered that he was not that friendly, gentle, walking from village to village, constantly helpful fellow. He was an arch bully, a sociopath, a murderer. And so I created a story that has since transmogrified into what I hope becomes an effective tool to make a dent in the almost cauterized psychology that many young children develop when they've spent a lot of time on the web. It uses imagination as the lever. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes of the story. It's a musical story, and you won't hear my voice, you'll hear the voices of other characters. And I'm going to sit in that chair, grab my guitar, and give you a moment of imaginative flash, and then I'll come back and explain how my process works. The story is called The Rage of Hercules, and it begins like this. Welcome, Hercules. Who are you? I can't see you. Oh, let your eyes adjust. This dark throne doesn't look familiar. You've seen it before. You stole my three-headed dog, Cerberus, for one of your famous labors. I didn't like that. Wait. Nor did I like when you rescued that faithful wife. You still don't know where you are. Well, Hercules, welcome back to the underworld. Only this time it is you who are dead. Hades. The new lady must be Persephone, queen of the dead. Oh, Hercules, I long for news of the living, and he's my queen. Always so eager to greet new arrivals. So, the great Hercules, how does it feel to have lived such a loud life, and now find yourself here in this silent place? I should not be here. Zeus and the fates decreed that when I died, I should go to Olympus. Oh, yes, Zeus, my overweening brother. Always so eager to tamper with people's lives, as he tampered with yours. I find you unamusing. Oh, still easy to get along with, aren't you? Wasn't that always a problem for you, Hercules, your attitude? You listen to me. If you'd been born the son of the greatest of the gods, an immortal woman, and all you got was a few paltry powers and no immortality to shield you from your mistakes, you would have a bad attitude too. But I overcame that. Still, you fancy you were mistreated. All my life I've wondered if I'd been born an ordinary man, free to love and go about his life, whether I'd have been a happier one. I will never know. Still, I had my glories. Oh yes, you cut a wide swath across the world, Hercules. You killed many men, monsters, lions, centaurs, even a few children, as I recall. Speak not of that. Oh, I've touched a nerve. I warn you, Hades. Oh, what are you going to do, strike me dead? Oh, very well, Hercules. Now, my brother Zeus intends to lift you up to Olympus, but first, I have my powers, you know. My wife, Persephone, she wishes to hear stories of the living while I have her trapped here. Simply tell us your story. And if I do, I am free. Yes, Hercules, you'll be free. And so, Hercules begins to tell, in the first person in this particular performance piece, his life story. I'm going to return to the table. Well, thank you. In the course of the description of this character's life story, students learn that he was an arrogant and aggressive young teen. He kills his music teacher in a fit of rage, striking the famous Linus over the head with a lyre. He has trouble with people all around him. He eventually marries and murders in a rage his wife and his children. And it is to expiate those terrifying deeds that he ends up spending most of his life performing what were supposed to have been 10, but ends up 12 labors. And during the arc of the story, he even spends 3 years living as a woman. I don't know if you know this about the myth of Hercules, but he is told once he kills a friend, Iphitus. He ends up a slave in the court of Queen Omphale. For 3 years, he has to dress in women's clothes. He learns to spin. And it is during that period of his life where this hypermasculine, extremely dangerous, deeply worried character begins to change. And the bullying self that is at work in him begins to dissolve. By the end of the tale, it's 100 minutes long, he has changed completely. And he has come to a realization that the cruelty that he dispensed to others all his life has done nothing but caused him great woe, and he is haunted by it until his moment of death. So it's a bit of a tragedy, but what it's designed to do is to show kids, firstly, that you can start out as one sort of a person. And this is the sort of the inner door, I hope, that can have some impact, small as it may be, upon children in their thinking. I just performed this whole story at Syracuse last week for a university audience, and we had a rousing discussion after it. I'll get to that. It tells them that, number one, you can be one way at one point, but you can change. Number two, if you do something here at this point in your life, there are indeed outcomes that await you later. For many young children, all the way up until, I suppose, they become 23 or so, and then they inherit their adult brains, have great difficulty imagining the outcomes of their actions, which may well be part of the entire bullying dilemma. If a story, in some fashion, can give them an arc of a life, then perhaps they will somehow internalize a little bit more of that self-restraint. Here we are in the absence of at least in America, at least in certain places in America, the traditional religion-derived ethical teaching that generations have grown up with in America, for better or worse. It seems that there might be some way to use stories to address the bullying issue and address the civility issue by using stories that children are exposed to and then asking them questions about how the stories make them feel. So the logic of a program that I've developed, which is called Young Hercules, the Legendary Bully, a program for learning empathy, asks students from middle school through high school and college to listen to the entire story, and then it offers them a series of 130 different questions. Some are content questions that are very simple to answer, but many are interpretive questions that ask them to project their own feelings onto the character of this Hercules who makes his way through this long tale. It seems to have worked at least last week. I told the story, and here I had juniors and sophomores and seniors in my audience at Syracuse. They listened to the entire story. It took them about an hour. It seems that once a certain point arrives in the tale, they just begin to image and they forget they're there, which is always helpful when performing for young audiences. And at the end, they answered a series of questions. The women began to talk to the men. And it began with the opening of doors. Should you open a door for me? I'm a woman. I don't think so. Are you rude not to at least attempt to open the door for me? Oh, and the young women in the audience went back and forth about this. And then we moved on to the web and anonymity and how easy it is to bully someone in a group. I asked, does the fact that you're anonymous, and this is interesting because I just learned from Tracy that this hasn't been documented in certain populations, but these were college kids. They made the point that it was so much easier to pile on when they didn't have to see the face of the victim. And they all raised their hand. They were quite forthcoming with these responses. And so, if there is a way to use myth and story to engender conversations that allow children to explore their feelings and their attitudes, then I hope this is one small contribution that can be made. The way this Hercules process is designed is that it has to take place face-to-face. You listen to the story. All the kids know that all the other kids have heard the same story. And then face-to-face among their peers, because adolescents being who they are, listening to adults like us is much like water off a duck's back. However, if they're listening to their peers, and there's that lever there, there is that sense that, oh, everyone is hearing me, either my response or my silence, which can be equally telling, then a sort of pressure cooker conversation, I hope, is engendered by a facilitator asking them these very, in some cases, provocative questions. There are issues of gay and straight. There are issues of male and female roles. Zeus is Hercules' absent father, who haunts him and is part of the rage that he feels. There are all manner of issues, I hope, at work in this ancient tale that are as prevalent and as important for people to discuss today as, obviously, in the Bronze Age, they were important. Otherwise, these ancient storytellers wouldn't have put together the elements of this old myth. Just before we began, we were talking about how young children need to be sensitized to these issues early on. As Elizabeth was pointing out, they're by third grade on the web. By third grade, they have access to immense flows of information, which cognitively is completely new. In species-wise, the flow of information that children are experiencing now is unprecedented in human history. Pardon me. And so the other notion that I would like to set out as part of our conversation tonight, and I'll close with this, is a set of stories called Golden Rule. These are stories that are appropriate for K through 2 audiences, 3 through 4. And once they get to the 5th and 6th grade, then this ponderous Hercules piece is more useful because their minds have matured. These are stories drawn from Japan, from Denmark. They're folk tales, but they all have one central message, and that is that kindness is something that can ultimately be rewarded more greatly than meanness. Very simple, ethical stories. There's not much to them, but they deliver a consistent message. And then afterwards, I have a discussion with the children. I ask them, well, how many of you have had your feelings hurt in the last week? How many of you remember what that was like? How many of you came to school angry at something this last week? Do you remember what that was? If you came to school angry for some reason this week, were you angry at your friends and they hadn't done anything? Did that anger spill over? Basic questions about feelings. And as the conversation progresses, I end up asking them, and this is a new notion, but I'd love my colleagues' feedback on this. Some of this is very new and very experimental. What if, instead of asking young children not to do something, you instead posed a kind of set of goals about doing something? And the phrase that came to me, and I'm not sure if it's going to stick, and the last time this phrase was used, I Googled this, was in 1883, is becoming a knight, K-N-I-G-N-H-T, of the Golden Rule. Knights of the Golden Rule behave in a certain way. They have a certain very simple code. They don't hurt anyone. They don't hurt, including animals. They protect the helpless. They, of course, are boys and girls. Ladies no longer need to be rescued. It's one of the key things that the girls in the audience are asked to consider. But rather, they too can become knights. And so it's sort of club that children might be able to join, and it might have an effect. So those are the approaches that I, as an artist, have been attempting to make, as opposed to scientists.
Thank you, Odds. And welcome to the Cambridge Forum, where we're discussing bullying and cyberbullying. I did want to make one comment that might tie it all together. And as a child psychiatrist, when we look at children and the way they learn information, we find that sometimes children can learn better through hearing as opposed to reading, or by processing the material and then having to speak of it. And so using their mouth and moving their mouth and saying words makes the information metabolized differently. And I guess I'm wondering if the neurochemistry of hearing a musical performance might make Odds's program super glue better than maybe other kinds of programs. That your program actually is accessing and lighting up different parts of the brain and changing neurochemistry because you're using music.
It would be a nice thought. I defer to the experts on that one.
So I did have one question for all of you and then one for each of you. I don't think bullies should be punished. I think they need to be contained. But until we learn an awful lot more about the bully, I can't see it would be humane to punish them. So Tracy, when you mentioned there's a law where bullies are punished, I can see containing them until they achieve their developmental milestones or get their serotonin where it needs to be, but punishment doesn't sit well. I'd like to hear from each.
It's what you think punishment is. I mean, punishment is removing them from the school, right? So, I mean, we don't use corporal punishment, of course. And I hear what you're saying. At the end of the day, though, they're violating the rights of others. And, I mean, from the perspective of the victim, if nothing's being done, and I don't know what you mean by contain them, but if nothing's being done, then it sends a message that I think is problematic. I mean, I come from a country where we rarely have life sentences for big crimes. I mean, you'd have to kill 20 kids to stay in prison for life. And we do not have capital punishment. No, seriously. I mean, our system is about rehabilitation. And so I think it's probably, I don't know what you thought I meant by punished.
Yeah, I thought I don't know, writing
It's
something
usually
100 times.
No, it's more suspension or something of like, and it's progressive discipline we use. So clearly, every situation requires some common sense. We used to have zero tolerance policies, but they seem to not work because again, there are obviously mitigating circumstances. These are complicated interactions.
I guess by containing, if the world were perfect, you'd look at the single incident with a single bully, and if it was an impulse control problem, you'd have them take time out, and you'd teach them about the impulse that they lost control of, and that
I
would
think
be...
you're thinking of protecting the target. That's what you're thinking of, not permitting them to
Correct.
abuse others.
That's what containment
But
would be.
I would change the word punishing to consequences.
Okay.
Consequences are very important, but consequences are not necessarily punitive. It's not necessarily the issue of punishing them, but it's very important that a child who abuses others engenders a reaction from society so that they are able, hopefully, to learn from this experience. Now, some children are going to have a much harder time learning, regardless of consequences. But you have to look at how to teach them, and you also have to look at how to protect children who are targets. And it's an extremely painful experience, as Tracy was describing. It's an extremely painful experience to be a target. And it's very important that these children understand that adults and schools and society in general recognizes their victimization and recognizes that they don't deserve this and that they deserve to be protected. So consequences, I think, were identified very early. But on the other hand, the carrot works better than the stick. And so Odds is right as well in that it's going to be more effective in terms of social education to say to children, not just, here's all these lists of bad things and we don't want you to do any of them, but also to say to them, look at what you can do. Let's talk about how much of a difference you can make in your society, with your friends, in your school, and let's try to inspire you to be the kind of person who really works against this. We actually have found that sometimes children who bully, who have excellent leadership skills, turn out to be fabulous anti-bullying crusaders. Sometimes that happens. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it happens. And so I think it's sort of a way, I think it's a matter of framing it a little differently than the word punishment, and I'm certain that that's exactly what Tracy meant, not punish exactly, because it would be hard to have a statute that dictated a specific punishment.
Right.
And when I said it, I had my brain registered the error because I paused after. But I would just argue too that consequence is just a euphemistic label for punishment, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about, the person who has the consequences that they have to address doesn't like it. So in any event, I'll just whatever label we want to use, there has to be some sort of outcome, and we need to support victims. We need to have clear rules, and that's what the anti-bullying literature, so the prevention and intervention research suggests.
Okay. So Elizabeth, go ahead.
Can I just,
Yes.
Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier that you were part of those who drafted the Massachusetts law. And what, could you describe for us the consequences of, let's say, the principal dragging you in for an extended bullying of somebody else? What sort of consequences, either disciplinary or eventually, I understand, legal, are there?
The law in Massachusetts does not dictate specific consequences. What it requires is it requires school districts and schools to think in advance and to plan in advance what kinds of consequences or punishments or other things will follow if these behaviors are determined to occur. But it leaves it up to individual schools and individual districts to decide what kinds of steps they want to take. So it's not specific in that regard. It just says that you have to think about it before it happens. You can't fly by the seat of your pants and say, oh, gee, what should I do with this? You're required to consider it beforehand.
Thanks.
Sure.
So Elizabeth, when we spoke, you had talked to me about, I guess it's the wall and multiple children posting, and the inflation of the experience. And I wondered if you could explain to the audience how cyberbullying makes something much larger than it is.
Yeah, one of the phenomenon that's very interesting about online communications, and this is true not just in bullying and abuse situations, it's actually true in positive situations as well. And it has to do with repetition. So when people, one of the phenomenon that we see in the research, but we also see this very frequently in the field as well, and particularly as an issue among girls, which is interesting, is that when they have some sort of problem or struggle or a relatively mild negative emotion about their friends, so for example, let's say they're a little upset with their friends, by doing things such as posting it or texting it to 53 friends and receiving back 27 texts that reaffirm their feelings, that reinforce them in the justification of how they're feeling, what happens is that the emotion involved inflates, it escalates. And the difficulty with that is that somebody who is sort of annoyed at the beginning of the day, rather than resolving the annoyance with their friends, by texting back and forth continually with people about this issue, they find themselves very angry within a couple of hours. The real issue is that they misattribute the anger. So instead of looking at it and saying, gee, the fact that I've been writing and talking and texting about this all day has now made me feel more angry, what they do is say, I'm angry at my friend because of what she did. And it's a very striking phenomenon, and it happens very frequently. It's far, far less common among boys than it is among girls. Boys are less likely to text repeatedly or to post repeatedly when they're experiencing emotion, and they're much more likely to let smaller issues go. Girls are looking for social support with their emotions, and so they reach out to their friends. The hard part is that whereas before we might have reached out by just talking to people, when you reach out electronically, you're sort of re-experiencing it over and over again.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And Tracy, when we spoke, you mentioned that giving Tylenol to the victim might mitigate the impact of being victimized. I wondered if we should all be carrying Tylenol around to help children these days.
There was a study that was recently published by DeWall that looked at the effects of acetaminophen on hurt feelings. And so when somebody says something bad to you, just pop a couple of Tylenol and all should be well. I'm obviously exaggerating. It's partly, it works on the central nervous system. I don't think we understand the mechanism. It needs to be replicated. But it's basically consistent with what I was discussing about the physical pain and social pain system overlapping. And so we know that acetaminophen has an effect on physical pain, and the fact that they share very similar neural networks, then it should have an effect on social pain. And this particular study showed that indeed it did.
Okay, thank you.
Does ibuprofen work?
No, no, it has to be acetaminophen. Yeah.
So Odds, I wanted to ask you, I hadn't realized that the museum had asked you to use Hercules, but do you believe you could have used Hansel and Gretel, and that witch was quite a bully to those children? Do you think you could have chosen a less mythic figure and made the same program?
Oh, yes. It was partly chance, and it was partly good luck, I think. One of the things that I think children still react to is the power of the spoken word, oddly enough, in this day and age. I perform for children all the time, and they will sit and listen, and an ancient part of their brains is activated, one that can't possibly be activated by texting, by any sort of video, by any manner of entertainment or projective entertainment. I've come to call it the inner storyteller. It's an ancient voice. I think it's a biophysical fossil, like the flight or fight response. It's ancient, and it is what happens when you hear a story spoken and told in a certain way, and the mind begins to project imaginative images. I understand that when imaginative images are projected, endorphins begin to enter the bloodstream. That's one of the things I've learned over the years. But I think it could be any story. I think the children still relate to narrative in a powerful way, particularly since they're faced with so many tumbling waves of constant influence, that something that is so simple and is mythic and approaches the unconscious mind with a language of symbols as well. We haven't even delved into that sort of approach, that stories speak in two languages. They speak in the language that we're using now, but they're also symbolic structures. The great Bruno Bettelheim, for instance, who wrote The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales, pointed out that young children who experience stories experience them in two ways. They hear them spoken or they hear them read, but they also experience them as sort of symbolic whirligigs that their unconscious minds listen to and can be instructed by. And so that's one of the reasons that I think myth is useful in overcoming that there's no way I'm going to listen to this adult barrier.
And I remember when my children were little, we heard, I think it was the Three Little Pigs, and huffing and puffing and blowing your house down. Do you ever find a reverse reaction, or where children get up and start trying to break things up because they want to huff and puff?
Not in performing that story.
Okay.
No, because I think children. I think they have a good little. They have an innate ethical sense, and these stories are ancient, and they're designed to fit like a molecule in an active site into their innate ethical sense. I think that's why these stories have survived.
All right. Can we ask the audience to come up? We're at the Cambridge Forum, and I'm sure you have lots of questions for this lovely panel.
For Dr. Vaillancourt, have you found a good way to explain to those principals who see the two different kids, one who can cope really well with bullying and another kid who they pass off as being overly dramatic or whatnot, without making that principal read a whole paper on brain chemistry? Is there a good way, a simple way to explain it to them?
Well, I give the talk, obviously this was a truncated version of the talk that I would give, and I give them to principals all over Canada, and it seems to work. It seems that people have a real interest in this area and a real interest in understanding heterogeneity. I know that in the area of child maltreatment, and this is where I became interested in it, when I saw a slide of, Bruce Perry has this great slide of a 3-year-old's brain that is not abused and a 3-year-old brain that is neglected, and you see it's smaller than a neglected brain, and the ventricles are enlarged like you would see in a person with schizophrenia. And that image speaks, like, it's just amazingly powerful at convincing people that we cannot abuse children, right? And that kind of science actually influenced policy dramatically in Canada and the United States in terms of child maltreatment. I think we need to show those similar scans of the brains of children who are being bullied. And that's sort of the evidence I'm trying to mount, is that this is not healthy. So the study I spoke about, the effects on memory, obviously the next logical step is to look at brain imaging and to actually see if there's some I would suspect there's going to be some changes. So we see that there are functional changes, but are there structural changes? So we could expect maybe atrophy in the areas where cortisol tends to have the greatest impact on the brain. So we would expect sort of the prefrontal and the hippocampus, that sort of thing. So it seems to work. It actually, people seem to be quite responsive to this. Obviously, it's not a program. At the end of the day, I always tell principals that they're the moral compass of their school and that their behavior needs to be beyond reproach. And I talk about how I can identify an unhealthy school by how the secretary greets me when I arrive. And if they treat me poorly, I suspect there's going to be a huge issue in their school, because the principal's door is open. He or she can hear this individual abusing their power daily and doing nothing about it. Right? So just little things like that seem to work, but I have no science behind if it works and the like.
Thank you. I think it's important to bring into the conversation why children bully. And as a psychotherapist, I have known quite a number of 4-year-old children who bully. And so often it's the home condition that is causing them to have that kind of behavior, and that just want to keep it in mind, because when we talk about the consequences, it's important that we think about what that child has experienced. And from my own experience with these children, so often they've been bullied by a sibling. And so Elizabeth, if you have any additional information around that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, we did find associations between being bullied by siblings, actually, and being a bully and being a target at school. My own hesitation to talk a great deal about parenting and about family style and bullying is that, first of all, I want very much to engage families in a positive way about this. I don't want to be finger-pointing, and I also don't think that this is just a family issue. I really don't. I think that telling educators that they should be looking for family problems in children with these behavior issues is probably not productive and is fairly regularly in a school setting not going to be true. There are other things that reinforce children for these behaviors. For example, bullying behaviors are pretty strongly associated with social status. And children are hardwired to seek that kind of acceptance and status. So they are going to be looking, as they grow, for things that are going to gain them traction with their peers socially. And this is something that anybody can do a little bit of. We can't all be tall and athletic and brilliant, and we can't all be those things. But anybody can be a little bit cruel to somebody lower down on the social scale. So I do think that it's very tempting, and I think that that kind of social status is a very strong reinforcement.
Come on. Yes, sir.
My question is addressed to Mr. Bodkin. Sounds to me like you were discussing Clockwork Orange, which it was a film that came out quite a few years ago about a youngster and two buddies of his who committed a rape and was brainwashed, basically, into changing his ways. But at any rate, my question is this. Anderson Cooper of CNN has been a correspondent, I believe, and still is, broadcasting the story of cyber bullying as it relates to the youngster who was killed while having a sexual relationship, a homosexual sexual relationship, and jumped in the river and committed suicide. I think you may have heard that story. And at any rate, what I'd like to find out, I know it's very difficult under the Constitution, as we know it, to prosecute a youngster for having done cyber bullying, but at any rate, could the same youngster be prosecuted for a hate crime? That's my question to you.
Thus far as I know, hate crimes have been defined as either deriving from race or from general ethnic tensions between people. I do not know whether they have gone with anti-gay, lesbian, transgender crimes into hate crimes. Perhaps someone knows more of that than I do.
In Massachusetts, that is part of the hate crime laws. In the Rutgers case, two of the students were prosecuted, or are being prosecuted. One of them is cooperating against the other student, but they are being prosecuted for it. And one of the charges, I believe, that's involved, although I'm not as familiar with New Jersey laws, is hate crimes. In Massachusetts, that would undoubtedly have engendered a hate crime. Well, schools, the issue that's being taken through federal court and circuit courts right now has to do with whether schools can have the jurisdiction to discipline cyberbullies. And the consensus so far, this has not gone to the Supreme Court, it has only gone as far as the circuit courts. The consensus so far is that the answer is usually no, because they have certain constitutional rights. Their freedom of speech rights extend to online behaviors. But my opinion is, as somebody who studies psychology, my opinion is that is missing the forest for the trees. That the issue should not simply be, can we punish the child who is a cyberbully? The issue has to be, how do we prevent these behaviors? How do we help children who are victimized by them? And how do we help the children who engage in them? And the disciplining of them is secondary, in my opinion.
And I agree as well. The amplification of the shame that young violinist felt, who then leapt off the bridge, goes back to the very same issue that you were bringing up, how you can have one experience if it's person to person and it's private, but when it is broadcast, there seems to be just so much more despair, to the point at which it's been leading to this rash of suicides, which has then been leading to a series of new laws being written because, again, we're back to that aspect of the web, just amplifying shame, even if you perceive it as yourself being shamed.
Well, why don't we take these last three questions then?
My question is about the way the schools are structured in my grandson's school district. Middle school starts at 5th grade. So, and this is a very personal question. He, in 4th grade, they called him the mayor. He knew everyone. He was totally socially integrated. He taught himself to dance like Michael Jackson. He performed for the school. He was walking high. He starts 5th grade, and he's short. He's short. He was told by kids on the bus he didn't belong in the school. He was too small. He was ridiculed because he played the viola. Two older girls knelt down in the hallway to see if they were taller than he. And his beginning in the 5th grade was just awful. And my daughter responded, and the school responded, and things have worked out. But my question is this unusual to have a middle school start at 5th grade when, the year before you were a baby, and then suddenly you're with 8th graders? And so is just that structure not a good structure?
I think it is unusual. In my experience, most middle schools are 6 through 8 in Massachusetts. However, to your other part of your question, it's actually my belief that in terms of social and developmental issues with children, I think the middle school model is a very unfortunate one. I think that children of that age are very vulnerable socially. They're at a very vulnerable point developmentally. They're easily tempted by abusive and aggressive behaviors. And I think that we would arguably have socially a better world, maybe not academically better, but socially better if we kept children in K through 8 schools. I think children of that age need younger children to be examples for, and I think they can use the older children to be examples for them. So I think that isolation is kind of unfortunate, but I understand why it's happened, and it has to do with economics, of course. And I think 5th grade is unusual.
Thank you.
Not unheard of, but unusual.
First, I want to say thank you because I think this very interdisciplinary approach to this issue has been very, very interesting and is too, unfortunately, undersold in the way we talk about these issues. I work in the field of domestic violence prevention and intervention. So I was very pleased to have Elizabeth early on in her discussion make the link between bullying and dating violence, because this is something that I see daily in my work and something that we've been addressing. I work with Transition House, which is Cambridge's many decades old domestic violence agency. And dating violence is something that we've been addressing as an agency for more than 20 years in a very formal and structured way with local schools. So I have a couple of comments and some questions for all of you to respond to. Starting with the notion that we know, based on a fairly long body of research now, that people who become bullies or experience bullies are far more likely to have grown up in households where they've experienced or witnessed some kind of abuse. That sets the stage, certainly, for wanting to link these issues causally, and yet the Massachusetts law deliberately severed discussion of bullying and dating violence completely, which set the stage going forward in schools to create kind of an unfortunate set of circumstances where these responses to bullying that schools are mandated to draw up completely exclude sexual violence and those kinds of behaviors. And we're in such a sort of regressive time educationally that we're kind of all scrambling to shore up these services when there are scarce resources and, far more detrimentally, scarce minutes in a school day to insert education around any of these issues. And
as I'm sure you're far too painfully aware, the legislation came with no financial resources. So there's actually no way to enforce any of this anti-bullying instruction in the school systems anywhere. So we've set out a sort of problem for ourselves, which leads me to my next question, which is how do we actually make change at the community level around these issues when there's zero incentive to actually address this in a meaningful way in our schools, number one. Number two, parents are more and more disconnected from their children's education, both in and out of school time. And three, there is this ever-expanding generational technological divide. So how do we get at this?
I think that in terms of the law and what it included or didn't include, there are so many elements that could have been fed into this law that are totally relevant and important to them. But that's not how you get legislation passed. And it was 4 years of work to get that passed, and very difficult. So it was simply never going to be possible to mandate that everybody do everything that we thought they should do and that we thought was worthwhile and important. In terms of it being an unfunded mandate, there are resources, notably MARC, in these school systems. We go to hundreds of school systems in Massachusetts every year, and they don't have to have any money to get us. So I would not accept the argument that there's no way for schools to do this without money. We're not the only free resource, by the way. We're certainly a very prominent one in Massachusetts, but there are others as well. And that wasn't actually an important part of passing the legislation. I got a lot of phone calls from very nervous legislators saying, you're not leaving, right? Like, you're going to stay in Massachusetts and you're not going to start charging, are you? Because we're not going to pass this if it means that schools have to spend a lot of money. I think there are really good motivations for people to do this, and I think the law is part of that motivation. And I think that a lot of people felt that was a necessary step, that we had to legislate some of the reasons why people had to do this. So, I mean, I don't know if Odds has had the same experience in the schools you work with, but I am finding that the sky has not fallen because of this law, but that schools actually are taking this issue more seriously and are looking at it from a much more committed point of view. I don't know if you found the same thing.
Well, my experience, at least at Syracuse, which I'd like to address, because you asked about the date rape issue. And I was on a panel with Jill Schultz, who is representative of the Rape Counseling Center at Syracuse. Date rape is a big problem on campus there. Males abusing females. It seems to have gotten to the point in that university community where it's become a frightening aspect for all the administrators. It seems to be out of hand, more so than in the past. And one of the issues that I address in the sort of, I don't know how to call it, the R-rated version, the university version of this story, is that this character is abusive and at first is not bothered by that, but is later haunted by his abuse of girls and women during his life. And what it does is, at least in the situation I encountered last week among university students, it engenders all manner of looks and boys sitting back and taking thought and women looking at men and all manner of interesting exchanges. Some of them were verbal and some of them were nonverbal. So that was the portion of your question that I felt I could answer. Of course, that's not appropriate, or perhaps it's appropriate at the high school level. Who knows? You said it was a neglected issue. Perhaps it's appropriate at the upper middle school level. But there are a great many, I think, social strictures that marshal against discussing sex in general with children of those ages. So that's a bit taboo. But once you're at the university level, then it seems to be a very different opportunity to air the issues.
So we're about at the end of our time. Shall we take a few more seconds? Okay, why don't we go ahead then? I hate to leave you out. Come
First,
on.
thank you very much for all the insights that you gave us. My question is a very personal. A very close relative of mine was bullied via Facebook. 15-year-old girl, her photo is taken, put into Facebook, and portrayed as a prostitute. What would you recommend to the victim and to its relatives? How to react is question number one. Question number two, how much energy should the relatives of that victim put into finding the perpetrator, who is anonymous till today? The Facebook site is closed down.
Well, that would be the first thing I would always recommend, is that I think that you need to report. When these things happen online, you need to report it. Now, websites vary in how responsive they are. Some are more responsive than others, but you need to document that this has happened and respond to it. I also think that you need to marshal the resources that these kids have in coping with it. So the things that really help children cope with these kinds of victimization are the connections they have, the relationships they have, their family, their friends, their activities, the things that make them feel good and that make them feel stronger. And when you have an anonymous person who's done something really cruel to you online, most of the time what makes kids cope better with these problems is all of those connections really being brought to the forefront. You sort of want to make the good parts bigger than the bad thing. Tracy could probably talk about this more on a technical level, but that from a psychological point of view, that's kind of what you're going for. And I think that doing that, making sure the website's closed down. In terms of trying to find the perpetrator, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm not sure how much I would put into it. I guess it depends on the circumstances. Quite honestly, it would depend on exactly what was put on the website and where the photo was taken, if you could tell from the background. Technical issues like that might give you clues. And if there's any indication that it's occurring, because if it happened online, something may be going on in school too. I would want to know if that was happening. Absolutely.
I don't know how many young children grow up with the old adage, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But when I was a little boy, I grew up being told that, and it was a piece of common child folklore. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And I think that that may well be something that you just might want to pass on, because it's a form of speech, it's obnoxious, but I think that children need to be armed in a bit of a traditional way as well. And I know that this goes counter to what a lot of the research says, toughen up. I know, I'll finish and I'll let you jump on me there. But it's an old adage that may toughen and aid a child at some point in some small way.
That's not supported by the neuroscience research. I'm sorry.
I know.
The other thing, too, I think we need to keep in mind is that one of the problems with cyberbullying is it creates a paranoia. You don't know who did it, so you think everybody's against you. So part of me wants to suggest that I guess it depends on how widespread the paranoia is. If she's destroyed by the idea that she can't figure out who's for her and who's against her, I'd put some effort into finding out who did it so she could put that to rest. I think that's the worst part about it. You go to school and you don't know who's on your side. And there's something to be said about good old-fashioned bullying, where it lasted from, the time you arrived at school until the time you left, and you knew who it was.
Actually, though, just to bust a myth, most of the time kids do know who it is online.
Yeah, at this
Anonymity is far overestimated. About 75% of the time, kids know who it is targeting them online. the anonymity that your niece experienced is actually in the minority.
How long ago was this? How long ago did this happen?
5 weeks.
And how's she doing now?
Fine. She's okay.
Okay.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I have no idea which students wrote those terrible things about me on ratemyprofessors.com.
Me too.
So I think that when it comes to cyberbullying your professor, it's usually anonymous.
Me too.
And I actually always tell kids that I get cyberbullied all the time. And that, part of life, I think, living in this day and age is understanding that people can very easily be casually cruel. They all understand that. And this is part of the new reality, I think, to some extent.
I have been very impressed by Quaker schools and by Montessori schools. And I realize that the parents of the children who go there are generally much more involved, or they wouldn't have selected those schools and paid for them. Nevertheless, the children who go to those schools also live in the metaculture. So they are influenced by the violence in our society, by other things. Is there anything, when you think about, is there a way to convey that kind of philosophy, the Montessori, Quaker philosophy, that might be able to help in the public schools? Thank you. How are you?
Yes, probably. I mean, I off the top of my head, the issue with, certainly with Quaker schools or with other schools that are founded upon certain religious groups, there are limitations to what we can do in public school settings, and I think we would all agree we want those limitations. There's also limitations based on things like what kind of, everybody doesn't come from the same social or ethnic or religious or sort of social mindset, as they tend to in independent schools, particularly independent schools that have a particular philosophy, which tend to attract people who agree with that philosophy. So, it's not that there's nothing to be learned from values and norms. There's a lot to be learned from values and norms, and really a lot of this has to do with values and norms. But that's a matter, I think, more of educating and energizing and empowering parents to really push values and norms. Maybe, schools should certainly reinforce some, but their role in a public school setting, I think, is necessarily going to be more limited.
I think everybody has to realize, though, aggression is healthy as well as unhealthy. So when preschools forbid children bringing toy guns in, and then the child arrives at school and picks up a block and starts making shooting noises, they're playing. It may not be a bad thing. Aggression fuels curiosity. Aggression fuels learning to read, gobbling up a book. So I think there has to be, it's on a spectrum from healthy aggression to the bullies who use aggression in a way that's destructive. Mm-hmm. Also, I don't recall what Montessori's philosophic position was, but I did consult to several Montessori schools. And at one, there were colored blocks, and the task at hand for the preschooler was to match blocks by color. And one child that I got to see playing decided to build a castle, and that was forbidden. That was taken away from the child because it was not finishing the task that was presented to the child. And so I found Montessori, that I don't know whether they were distorting the Montessori philosophy, but it was quite rigid, and it prevented the child's free use of imagination.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Experience at a Montessori school in Connecticut. Spent a week there. I'll have to disagree with you, Sasha. This was one of the most creative environments I've ever had the honor to be part of. We took a story, and within a week, the children produced an entire play with a complete orchestral accompaniment that they created themselves. They wrote their own lines, they learned to act an entire story, and by Friday, they performed it for their parents. So I think there are probably different Montessori schools as there are different public schools.
So thank you, Odds Bodkin. Thank you, Tracy Vaillancourt. And thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Englander. And you have been listening to a program of the Cambridge Forum. It's been recorded in September 2011, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled Bullies and Cyberbullies, or for additional information about the ongoing radio series and our forum network webcasts, visit us on web at cambridgeforum.com in Harvard Square. .org, sorry. In Harvard Square, I'm Sasha Helper, and thank you for joining us and listening to this exciting discussion.